Last time we spoke about the Visayas offensive. In March of 1945, the Pacific War was certainly raging on. On Iwo Jima, the U.S. Marines, after intense fighting and heavy casualties, declared the island finally secured. Meanwhile, in northern Luzon, General Clarkson's division advanced towards Baguio, facing fierce Japanese resistance while General Mullins pushed through the Valley Pass. The Japanese army, grappling with severe supply shortages, was forced to evacuate Baguio. In the Visayas, General Eichelberger's forces targeted the Sulu Archipelago and central Visayan Islands, securing key airfields. The 40th Division landed on Panay, capturing Iloilo, and launched an assault on northern Negros. On Cebu, the Americal Division landed near Talisay, encountering mines but minimal resistance, and secured Cebu City. By April, Allied forces had made strategic advances across the Philippines, overcoming Japanese resistance and establishing crucial airfields. This episode is the Invasion of Okinawa. Welcome to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a very long-format documentary covering the Boxer Rebellion and Russo-Japanese War, titled The Fight for Asia. And over at Echoes of War, we just started a brand new multi-part series covering the Malaysian campaign of World War II. Now, if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And I'm very excited to say, finally, I am releasing a rather special episode over there. It's the first part in a multi-part series covering an alternate history of the Pacific War. Now, it's not some kind of silly, how could Japan have won World War II scenario. It's grounded firmly in, honestly, a lot of statistics and a lot of research. The first episode is titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor, so please go check it out. We have come to the grand final battlefield at last, that of Okinawa. Of course, there's other battles raging on in all sorts of other theaters like New Guinea, China, Burma, etc. However, as you might imagine, it's becoming impossible, given the week-by-week format, to cover all of this every single episode. So we're going to have to hardcore focus on Okinawa for a while. But we will circle back to the other theaters to catch up. Seriously, this was the only logical way to do this. And honestly, in retrospect, I wish the entire podcast was campaign by campaign instead of week by week. But I am a mere podcaster following the YouTube series that this is built off of. So if you want to hear a more campaign by campaign series, well, on Echoes of War, me and my co-host Garev are beginning to roll them out. The first series will be on the entire Malayan campaign, and I think after that we might try to do the Philippines, and then we'll tackle them all one by one. Regardless, let's jump into what is the Invasion of Okinawa. As we left off, the directive issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on October the 3rd designated Okinawa as the final target for invasion, following the establishment of air and naval bases in Luzon and Iwo Jima. Capturing the crucial island would bring the conflict to Japan's doorstep, disrupting the enemy's air communications through the Ryukyu Islands and flank their maritime routes to the south. Consequently, from these newly established air and naval bases in the Ryukyus, American forces would be able to launch attacks on Japan's main islands and implement a more rigorous sea and air blockade, isolating them from the Japanese territories to the south. This made it imperative for the Japanese Empire to maintain control over Okinawa and the Ryukyus. To this end, the 32nd Army, led by Lieutenant General Watanabe Masio, was formed there by late March of 1944. Initially, it comprised 4 companies and 1 artillery regiment stationed at Amami Oshima, 5 companies and 1 artillery regiment at Nakakuzuku Bay, 4 companies, 1 artillery regiment at Iramote Island, along with various garrison units from the 19th Air District in Okinawa. Under Operation Tago, the Ryukyus and Formosa were to form a long zone of interprotective air bases. These bases were expected to defeat any American sea or air forces sent into the region. To avoid destruction from the air, each base was to consist of a cluster of airfields, such that if one were damaged, others could be used immediately. Military and civilian crews were promptly set to work building the numerous fields. 13 base clusters had been created, stretching in a line from Tacharai in the northern Ryukyus to Pingting on Formosa in the south. The only remaining tasks for ground forces were to defend these facilities and support their anchorages and the inevitable work of building the fields. Much of the energy of the 32nd Army would be absorbed building these air facilities. This was more difficult since the 32nd Army had only 2 bulldozers and 1 earth roller. Japan had produced dozers in small numbers at its Komatsu plant since 1943, but few had actually reached the front. Since soldiers were thus obliged to use shovels, hoes, straw baskets, and horse-drawn wagons, construction, as you can imagine, was quite slow. Moreover, because of enemy submarine raiders, it was impossible for the Japanese to deliver the large quantities of fuel, ammunition, and anti-aircraft guns needed to operate the bases. Even more seriously, the planes themselves were not even available. Between April and June, the 32nd Army received reinforcements, including the 44th and 45th Independent Mixed Brigades, the 21st Independent Mixed Regiment, and the 27th Independent Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, among other air garrison units. From these forces, Watanabe chose to send the 45th Brigade to establish bases on Miyako Island and the Ishigaki Island, while the 21st Regiment was tasked with setting up a base at Tokunoshima. On June the 27th, the 1st and 2nd Infantry, about 4,100 men, boarded the Toyama Maru and began a voyage to Okinawa. The 44th Brigade HQ, artillery and engineer units meanwhile boarded other vessels of the Taka 412 convoy. 2 days later, while the convoy was sailing east to Tokunoshima, the submarine Sturgeon successfully sank the Toyama Maru with 2 torpedoes, therefore inflicting the loss of 3,724 men and much of their heavy equipment. Because of this, the First Corps had been deactivated. Following the fall of Saipan, the Japanese Empire rapidly deployed significant ground forces to the 32nd Army, including the 9th, 24th, 28th, and 62nd Divisions, as well as the 59th, 60th, and 64th Independent Mixed Brigades and the 27th Tank Regiment. Additionally, the 15th Independent Mixed Regiment was airlifted to bolster the beleaguered 44th Brigade, which was reorganized into the 2nd Corps with its local recruits. The 32nd Army staff wished to use much of the indigenous population as it could in direct support of the war effort, so on January 1st, 1945, it ordered total mobilization. All Okinawan males aged 18 to 45 were obliged to enter the Japanese service. 39,000 were drafted, of whom 15,000 were used as non-uniform laborers and 24,000 as rear echelon troops called the Home Guard, or Boitai. Many of the Boitai replaced sea-based battalions and rear area supply units that had been reorganized and equipped for frontline duty. In addition to these, 1,500 of the senior boys of the middle schools on Okinawa were organized into Iron and Blood volunteer units and assigned frontline duty. Some of these students had been tried out in signal service in the autumn of 1944 with some good results, so the program was expanded. Since the fall of 1944, 600 senior students of the girls' middle schools had also been given training in medical service. By the way, I think it's pretty important to point out, at this point, Okinawans are not considered Japanese per se. They're kind of their own indigenous group. Thus, the Japanese actually don't treat them that well, as you can imagine, and horrifyingly, many, and I mean many of them, will suffer during the Battle of Okinawa. While most of these troops were sent to strengthen the main defenses at Okinawa, a large portion of the 20th Division was actually assigned to reinforce the garrisons on the Miyako and Yaeyama Islands. The 36th Regiment was dispatched to support the Daito Islands, the entire 45th Brigade was moved to garrison Ishigaki, and the rest of the Yaeyamas. The 59th Brigade was tasked with defending Irubo Island, the 60th Brigade was sent to reinforce Miyako Island, and the 64th Brigade was deployed to Amami Islands. On August 9th, Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru took command of the 32nd Army. His initial strategy was to occupy all of Okinawa with a strong force and eliminate any invading troops at their landing sites. However, as fierce fighting began on Leyte, Intensive training for the troops commenced, including divisional maneuvers at potential American landing points, artillery bombardments of beachheads, and nighttime assaults on bridges. However, on November the 13th, Tokyo decided to send the elite 9th Division to Formosa to prepare for a movement to the Philippines that ultimately did not occur. The unexpected withdrawal of the 32nd Army's best division disrupted Ushijima's operational plans. Ironically, the situation improved combat efficiency as it compelled the army to achieve more with fewer resources. Ushijima chose to concentrate most of his forces in the mountainous and easily defensible Shimajiri area, located in the southern part of the island. This strategic location allowed the Japanese to maintain control over Naha Port and target the northern airfields with artillery. Similar to the situation in Iwo Jima, this decision marked a departure from the previously favored strategy of decisive battle, opting instead for a war of attrition that had proven effective on Peleliu and Iwo Jima. As a result, Ushijima positioned Lieutenant General Amamiya Tatsume's reinforced 24th Division at the southern end of the island, Lieutenant General Hongo Yoshio's reinforced 62nd Division along the central isthmus, Major General Suzuki Shigeji's reinforced 44th Independent Mixed Brigade on the Hagayushi Plain, and Colonel Udo Takahiko's Kunigami Detachment, consisting of 2 battalions from the 2nd Corps in northern Okinawa. These troop placements were successfully implemented in December. However, concerns arose that the 32nd Army was spread far too thin to effectively counter anticipated enemy invasions. Consequently, on January the 15th, Ushijima decided to move the 44th Brigade from the Hagayushi Plain southwards to overlap with the 62nd Division's area on the east, significantly shortening the Japanese front. Additionally, 1 battalion from the Kunigami Detachment was sent to defend Uejima and its crucial airbase, which necessitated the rest of the unit to consolidate its positions and strengthen defenses on Yaedake Mountain in the Matobu Peninsula. Ushijima also had the support of the brigade-sized 5th Artillery Group led by Lieutenant General Wada Kuzuke, the 21st Field Anti-Aircraft Artillery Corps, the 11th Shipping Group, which included several shipping engineer regiments and sea raiding battalions, the 19th Air District overseeing various aviation service units, and Rear Admiral Ota Minoto's Okinawa Naval Base Force, which comprised nearly 9,000 personnel stationed at the Oroku Naval Air Base near Naya. Ushijima had nearly 100,000 troops at his command, with 29,000 assigned to specialized units for anti-aircraft, sea raiding, and airfield operations. Anticipating the nature of the impending conflict, these well-staffed service units were reorganized for ground combat. The 19th Air District transformed into the first specially established regiment, responsible for defending Yantan and Kandina airfields it had recently constructed and maintained. Most of the service personnel were integrated into the new first specially established brigade in the Naya Yonebaru area, while the sea raiding base battalions became independent infantry units. Additionally, the remainder of the 11th Shipping Group was reconstructed into the 2nd Specially Established Brigade on the southwestern part of Okinawa. This reorganization, completed on March 21st, bolstered the ground combat strength to 14,000 men, leaving only about 10,500 of the 67,000 Army personnel in specialized roles. To protect themselves, the Japanese began constructing robust fortifications, tunnels, and cave systems to shield against anticipated enemy bombardments. Work on the caves was begun with great vigor. "Confidence in victory will be born from strong fortifications," was the soldiers' slogan. The caves meant personal shelter from fierce bombardments that were sure to come. They also offered a shimmering hope of victory. The combination was irresistible, and units began to work passionately on their own caves. Enthusiasm was essential because of the great toil it took to create said caves. Just as the 32nd Army had only 2 bulldozers to make airfields, it also had no mechanized tunneling equipment at all. Besides lacking cutting equipment, the 32nd Army also lacked construction materials. It also had no cement, no ironware, no dynamite. The units had to rely entirely on wooden beams that they had obtained themselves to shore up the shafts. This was not necessarily easy, as you can imagine, because there were no forests in the south of the island, where the troops were now stationed. Pine forests were abundant in the mountainous north, however, so each unit was assigned its own lumbering district in the north. Several hundred men from each division were detailed in lumbering squads. The problem remained, however, as to how to move several million logs that were needed over 40 or so miles from the forest to the forts. With no railroads and the use of trucks limited by a shortage of gasoline, the solution for each unit was to cut its own logs and then transport them in small native boats called sabines. The divisions acquired about 70 of these that they used from the north to the south. In January of 1945, however, the Leyte-based B-24s that began flying over daily for reconnaissance also began strafing said boats. So the waterborne delivery of logs had to be switched from day to night, greatly lowering efficiency. Ushijima aimed to prolong the fight from these positions, and he decided to destroy the indefensible Yontan and Kadena airfields to prevent their use by the enemy, effectively ending the ineffective air defense strategy initially devised by Tokyo. Meanwhile, Admirals Nimitz and Spruance were preparing for Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. Given the expectation that the capture of Iwo Jima and recent air assaults in Japan would concentrate enemy air power around the empire's core, which would respond aggressively to any attacks on Okinawa, the Americans needed to first neutralize or eliminate enemy air facilities in the Ryukyus, Kyushu, and Formosa to achieve air superiority over the objective. As a result, all available carrier-based and land-based air forces were tasked with this operation, including Admiral Mitscher's Task Force 58, General Kenny's Far East Air Forces, Admiral Hoover's Central Pacific Forward Area, and General Arnold's 20th Air Force. From the 20th Air Force, General LeMay's 21st Bomber Command was assigned to attack Okinawa before moving on to Kyushu and other vulnerable locations in the home islands. Meanwhile, Brigadier General Roger Ramey's 20th Bomber Command supported General Chennault's 14th Air Force, focusing on neutralizing Formosa. Aircraft from the Southwest Pacific area were also sent to conduct searches and continuous strikes against Formosa as soon as conditions on Luzon allowed. Additionally, the British carriers of Vice Admiral Bernard Rawlings' Task Force 57 were tasked with neutralizing air installations on the Sakishima Group in 10 days leading up to the landings. Once air superiority was achieved, Spruance's 5th Fleet was to land Lieutenant General Simon Buckner's 10th Army, which included Major General John Hodge's 24th Corps and Major General Roy Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps. The 24th Corps comprised the 7th and 96th Divisions, while the 3rd Amphibious Corps included the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions. As the commanding general of the expeditionary troops, Buckner oversaw the 27th and 77th Divisions and the 2nd Marine Division for special operations and reserve purposes. Furthermore, the 81st Division was held in Area Reserve. In total, Buckner commanded a force of 183,000 troops, with 116,000 designated for the initial landings. The plan called for Major General Andrew Bruce's 77th Division to first secure amphibious bases in the Karima Islands on March 26th, with one battalion further securing Kaisejima 5 days later to establish a field artillery group there. On April the 1st, following a demonstration by the 2nd Marine Division in southern Okinawa, the main landings were set to take place. The 24th Corps and the 3rd Amphibious Corps would land simultaneously on the west coast, beaches north and south of Higuchi. After landing, both corps were to quickly advance across the island, capturing the airfields in the designated areas before securing all of southern and central Okinawa. Subsequently, Buckner's forces were to invade and secure Iijima and northern Okinawa. Once this was achieved, there were tentative plans to launch an invasion of Kikajima with the 1st Marine Division and Miyako Island with the 5th Amphibious Corps. For the invasion, Spruance relied on the covering force under his command, along with Admiral Turner's Joint Expeditionary Force. This force included Admiral Blandy's Amphibious Support Force, which comprised minesweepers, UDTs, and escort carriers. Rear Admiral Morandeo's Gunfire and Covering Force, consisting of 10 battleships and 8 heavy cruisers. Rear Admiral Lawrence Reifsnyder's Northern Attack Force, responsible for landing the 3rd Amphibious Corps, and Rear Admiral John Hall's Southern Attack Force tasked with landing the 24th Corps. Similar to Iwo Jima, Okinawa had endured multiple air attacks since October of 1944 as part of the preliminary operations for the landing on Leyte, Luzon, and Iwo Jima that we had previously discussed. These operations also included airstrikes aimed at neutralizing Japanese air power on Formosa. Throughout February and March, Mitscher's carriers and LeMay's B-29 bombers brought the conflict back to the Japanese home islands with a series of strikes that caused significant damage and instilled fear into the population. On March the 1st, Task Force 58 launched the first strike of the month against the Ryukyus, targeting Amami, Minami, Kume, Tokuno, and Okino, as well as Okinawa. This operation resulted in the destruction of 41 planes, the sinking of 11 vessels, and the damage of 5 others, with significant harm to island facilities. In between the main assaults on Japan, the superfortresses frequently targeted key cities in Ryukyus, leading the beleaguered Japanese forces to refer to these missions as the regular run. Throughout March, aircraft from the Southwest Pacific and the Marianas conducted nearly daily operations over the Ryukyus and the surrounding waters, searching for Japanese shipping and contributing to the isolation of Okinawa by sinking cargo ships, luggers, and other vessels, while American submarines intensified the blockade around the Ryukyus. Meanwhile, after completing extensive training and rehearsals, Task Forces 51 and 55 gathered at Leyte, Task Force 53 assembled in the Guadalcanal-Russell's area, and the rest of the 5th Fleet convened at Ulithi. On March 12th, Reifsnyder's convoy carrying the 3rd Amphibious Corps was the first to depart, successfully reaching Ulithi 9 days later. On March 18th, the tractor group transporting the 77th Division began its journey from Leyte to Kurima Islands. That same day, Mitscher's carriers targeted 45 airfields in Kyushu, claiming the destruction of 102 Japanese planes, damaging and destroying 275 on the ground, sinking 6 vessels, and damaging 3 more. In response, Admiral Ugaki's 5th Air Fleet launched a counterattack against the carriers Enterprise, Intrepid, and Yorktown, inflicting just minor damage while losing 33 aircraft. The next morning, after locating the majority of the combined fleet at Kure, Mitscher dispatched 436 aircraft to target naval installations and shore facilities in the Inland Sea. At 6:50 a.m., 3 CN Sayun Mert recon planes discovered Task Force 58, and by 7 a.m., Captain Genda Minoru's elite hand-picked 343rd Kokutai had scrambled 63 advanced Kawasaki N1K2J, codenamed George, Shiden Kai fighters from Shikoku to intercept the Americans. Minutes later, Genda's powerful Shiden Kais, quote, wadded into Hellcats and Corsairs as if the clock had been turned back to 1942. Soon, the 343rd Kokutai was engaged in a wild maelstrom with 80 U.S. fighters, including VF-17 and VBF-17 Hellcats from Hornet and VMF-112 Corsairs from Bennington. For once, the Japanese broke about even, losing 24 fighters and 1 scout plane to the Americans, 14 fighters and 11 bombers. Nevertheless, Genda's expert but outnumbered 343rd Kokutai proved unable to blunt the American onslaught. Despite facing formidable intercepting forces, they managed to inflict damage on 18 Japanese warships, including the battleships Yamato, Issei, Hyuga, and Ryuna, as well as 6 aircraft carriers. Additionally, 1 incomplete submarine was destroyed, 97 enemy planes were shot down, and 225 were either destroyed or damaged at Japanese airfields. In response, Ugaki launched a kamikaze counterattack that successfully struck the carriers Wasp and Franklin, causing significant damage and forcing Franklin to head back to Pearl Harbor immediately. As Task Force 58 slowly withdrew that afternoon on March 20th, a damaged Zero crashed into destroyer Halsey Powell, killing 12 and wounding 29. Shortly thereafter, friendly anti-aircraft fire started fires aboard Enterprise. At 11, 8 Japanese torpedo planes unsuccessfully attacked the carriers, while 3 overnight snoopers were splashed by anti-aircraft fire. Between March 17th and March 20th, Ugaki had committed 193 aircraft to the battle, and he lost 161 of them. On March 21st, Ugaki dispatched a 48-plane strike, including 16 G4M Betty bombers, carrying the very first Oka, or cherry blossom, suicidal missiles. However, the combat air patrol of 150 Hellcats and Corsairs repulsed them. Franklin, Wasp, and Enterprise were all damaged, and they had to steam to Ulithi as a reorganized Task Group 58.2, except for April the 8th to the 17th when Task Group 58.2 was briefly reestablished. Task Force 58's strength would remain at 3 task groups throughout Iceberg's duration. Ugaki's 5th Air Fleet was, meanwhile, effectively incapacitated for several weeks, but Ugaki nevertheless reported 5 carriers, 2 battleships, and 3 cruisers sunk, which Imperial General Headquarters found very hard to believe, as you can imagine. Meanwhile, the mine flotilla departed Ulithi on March 19th, followed 2 days later by the rest of Task Force 52 and Task Force 54 to support the Kurima operation. On March 23rd, to prepare for the imminent minesweeping operations of Iceberg, Task Force 58 conducted extensive bombing raids on all known installations in Okinawa, resulting in significant damage and the sinking of 24 vessels and damage to 3 others over the following 5 days. Furthermore, Admiral Lee's battleships traversed the cleared area and opened fire on Okinawa, sinking an additional 2 vessels. With its naval and air support, Blandy's minesweepers and UDTs successfully cleared the route for Rear Admiral Ingolf Kinlade's Western Islands Attack Group by nightfall of March the 25th. Their primary opposition in the following 2 days consisted of a series of kamikaze attacks, which caused damage to the battleship Nevada, light cruiser Biloxi, 4 destroyers, 2 destroyer mine layers, 1 minesweeper, and 2 transports, while the destroyer Halligan was sunk by mines. The next morning, supported by naval gunfire and carrier aircraft, Bruce initiated his first landings. The 3rd Battalion, 305th Regiment landed on the southern beaches of Aka Island, facing sporadic resistance. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion, 306th Regiment landed unopposed on Gurima Island, which was quickly secured. The 2nd Battalion, 306th Regiment achieved faster success at Hokkaji Island, while the 1st Battalion, 305th Regiment invaded Zamami Island with light resistance. The 2nd Battalion, 307th Regiment encountered minor opposition as it took Yakabi Island, and the Fleet Marine Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion scouted Kasujima and found no enemy presence there. After encountering some resistance, the units of Aka and Zamami pushed back the enemy garrisons, securing 2/3 of Aka by nightfall, and successfully repelling a strong counterattack on Zamami that night. Simultaneously, Dayo's warships and Blandy's carriers began bombarding the demonstration beaches, while minesweepers cleared progressively larger areas around Okinawa, although the minesweeper Skylark was sunk by mines. By March 27th, the remaining enemy forces on Aka and Zamami were finally eliminated, and a company took Amuro Island without any opposition. Additionally, a company from the 307th moved to Kube Island, which was quickly secured. At the same time, Bruce continued his main landings, with the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 306th Regiment landing on the west coast of Tokashiki Island, facing minimal opposition. As the 2 battalions advanced north along narrow trails towards Takashiki town, the 3rd Battalion landed to secure the southern part of the island. On March 28th, they reached the town, clearing the entire island and concluding the Kurima operation. Within Kurima, island chained between happiness and good, as it was called, the Japanese tradition of self-destruction emerged horribly in the last acts of soldiers and civilians trapped in the hills. Camping for a night on March 28th, a mile from the north tip of Tokashiki, troops of the 306 heard explosions and screams of pain in the distance. In the morning, they found a small valley littered with more than 150 dead and dying Japanese, most of them civilians. Fathers had systematically throttled each member of their families, and then they disemboweled themselves with knives or hand grenades. Under one blanket lay a father, 2 small children, a grandfather, and a grandmother, all strangled by cloth ropes. Soldiers and medics did what they could. The natives, who had been told that the invading barbarians would kill and rape them all, watched with their amazement as Americans provided food and medical care. An old man who had killed his daughter wept in bitter remorse. Only a minority of the Japanese, however, were suicides. Most civilians struggled into American positions worn and dirty. In all, the 77th took about 1,195 civilians and 121 military prisoners. This operation resulted in the deaths of 530 Japanese soldiers, 121 captured, and the neutralization of over 350 suicide boats, with American losses totaling 31 killed and 81 wounded. While this initial operation was underway, the tractor groups of the Southern and Northern Attack Forces left their staging areas in Luzon and Ulithi on March 25th, followed by the rest of Spruance's fleet 2 days later. On the 26th and 27th, Rawlings Task Force 57 conducted a series of strikes on Sakishima Islands, primarily targeting Miyako. Meanwhile, after a 250-plane raid on the Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya on March 24th, LeMay sent 165 B-29s from the 73rd and 314th Bombardment Wings to attack the Kyushu airfields on March 27th, whom faced minimal resistance as they caused significant damage to the Tachira Army Airfield, the Oita Naval Airfield, and the Omura Aircraft Plant. Other bombers from the 313th Bombardment Wing laid aerial mines in the Shimonoseki Strait. The Japanese responded with a raid on Spruance's naval units using aircraft and suicide boats on the night of March 28th, resulting in 1 LCM being destroyed and 1 cargo ship being damaged. On the 29th, Mitsuru launched another strike against Kyushu, but poor weather conditions led to only minor damage, with 12 vessels sunk and 1 damaged. By this point, the largest assault sweep operation ever executed had cleared the Hagushi Beach's approaches in 75 sweeps, with minesweepers clearing 3,000 square miles of coastal waters. The following morning, as Task Force 58 once again targeted Okinawa, Dayo's 10 battleships and 11 cruisers advanced to bombard Okinawa's defenses and demolish coastal seawalls with increased intensity. At the same time, the 314th sent 12 planes to attack the Mitsubishi engine works in Nagoya overnight. The next day, LeMay dispatched 152 B-29s for his second assault on Kyushu, completely destroying the Tachira machine works and heavily damaging the Omura airstrip. On March 31st, back in Okinawa, the final underwater demolition operation off the Hagushi beaches was underway while the 420th Field Artillery Group was successfully positioned on Kusujima, prompting a strong reaction from Usujima's artillery. That morning, a Ki-43 fighter crashed into Admiral Spruance's flagship, the Indianapolis, resulting in the deaths of 9 crew members and severely damaging a shaft, which ultimately compelled Spruance to transfer his flag to the battleship New Mexico. Meanwhile, the Frogmen completed their last demolition operations off Hakuishi, and the final preliminary bombardment of Okinawa and the Sakishima Islands was executed successfully. By the end of the month, over 13,000 large-caliber shells have been fired in the shore bombardment, and approximately 3,095 sorties have been conducted against the Ryukyus. However, effective Japanese concealment prevented significant damage to Ushijima's defenses. As night fell, a vast fleet of transports, cargo ships, landing craft, and warships navigated the final miles of their long journey, successfully meeting off the Higuchi beaches in the East China Sea before dawn on April the 1st. While Turner's forces prepared for the landing, a fire support group consisting of 10 battleships, 9 cruisers, 23 destroyers, and 177 gunboats began the pre-landing bombardment of the beaches at 5:30, firing a total of 44,825 rounds of shells, 33,000 rockets, and 22,500 mortar shells. In response, the Japanese launched some scattered kamikaze attacks on the convoys, successfully hitting the transport Hinsdale and LST-884. At 7:45, carrier planes from Task Force 58 and Blandy's carriers targeted the beaches and nearby trenches with some napalm. 15 minutes later, the first wave of amphibious tanks advanced towards the shore at 4 knots, followed closely by 5 to 7 waves of assault troops in amphibious tractors. Alongside the primary landings, Major General Thomas Watson's 2nd Marine Division staged a feigned landing on the southeast coast of Okinawa near Minatoga, aiming to distract the enemy's reserves in the region. Meanwhile, on the main front, supported by rocket fire from LCI gunboats and artillery fire from Kesejima, a nearly continuous line of landing craft advanced towards the beaches at 8:20. Encountering no resistance, the first waves began to land on their designated beaches at 8:30, with additional troops following closely behind them. Within an hour, Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps had successfully landed the assault elements of the 6th and 1st Marine Divisions north of the Bishi River, while Hodge's 24th Corps disembarked the 7th and 96th Divisions south of the river. The lack of significant opposition, coupled with the rapid disintegration of the untrained 5,473 airfield service troops of the 1st Specially Established Regiment under heavy air and artillery bombardment, created a sense of foreboding amongst the men, prompting them to scout the area cautiously. As before, the enemy's primary response consisted of kamikaze attacks on naval units, resulting in damage to the battleships West Virginia and Tennessee, the British carrier Indefatigable, destroyers Princhet and Vanman, the British destroyer Ulster, the destroyer Minelair Adams, and 4 other vessels. Returning to Okinawa, after ensuring they were not walking into a trap, the troops began advancing inland while tanks and other support units were being brought to the beaches. In the north, Major General Lemuel Shepard's 6th Marine Division deployed Colonel Merlin Schneider's 22nd Marines on the isolated Green Beaches and Colonel Alan Shapley's 4th Marines on the Red Beaches near Yontan Airfield. The 4th Marines advanced towards Yontan, encountering only scattered resistance and quickly securing the objectives east of the airfield by about 1 o'clock. Meanwhile, Schneider's 3rd Battalion moved through Hansa without any opposition, but the 2nd Battalion's progress was hindered as it needed to protect its exposed flank, prompting the 22nd Marines to quickly commit its reserve battalion to maintain their momentum. To the south, Major General Pedro de Valle's 1st Marine Division landed Colonel Edward Schneidecker's 7th Marines on the Blue Beaches and Colonel John Gribble's 5th Marines on the Yellow Beaches just north of the Bishi River. By 9:45, the 7th Marines on the left had advanced through the village of Sobe, their primary objective, while the 5th Marines were positioned 1,000 yards inland. At this point, it was decided to land the reserve battalions of both regiments along with Colonel Kenneth Chappell's 1st Marines. With forces arranged in depth and reserves positioned to the right and left, de Valle's units continued to advance steadily over the rolling terrain, as the 11th and 15th Marines artillery units were also being landed. At 1:30, the 4th Marines resumed their advance, facing light resistance on the left, but becoming overextended on the right, while trying to maintain contact with the 7th Marines. As a result, Shapley landed his reserve battalion to fill this gap, while Shepard also deployed his reserve 1st Battalion 29th Marines to secure the critical northern flank, allowing the 22nd Marines to keep advancing eastwards. Meanwhile, further south, Major General Archibald Arnold's 7th Division disembarked Colonel Frank Patchler's 17th Regiment on the Purple Beaches just south of the Bishi River, and Colonel John Finn's 32nd Regiment on Orange Beaches in front of the Kadena Airfield. Both regiments quickly ascended the gentle hills and the landing sites, and they began advancing eastward. By about 10 o'clock, the 27th Regiment had patrols at Kadena Airfield, whom discovered it to be empty. By 10:30, the front line was crossing the airstrip. Just moments later, it advanced about 200 yards beyond, heading towards Cholan. Simultaneously, the 32nd Regiment secured the southwestern edge of Kadena and continued along the road towards Kozo. To the south, Major General James Bradley's 96th Division landed Colonel Michael Halloran's 381st Regiment on the White Beaches in front of Sanabe, and Colonel Edwin May's 383rd Regiment on the Brown Beaches at the extreme southern flank. Both regiments moved eastwards with some ease as other units that day made significant progress towards Momobaro in the north and successfully captured Chetan in the south. Additionally, all divisional artillery of the 24th Corps landed early. Hodges' reserve regiments and battalions were successfully brought ashore, and by nightfall, direct support battalions were in position. Thus, by the end of the day, over 60,000 men had been landed, suffering 28 deaths, 27 missing, and 104 wounded, thereby establishing a beachhead 15,000 yards long and up to 5,000 yards deep in some areas. Shepard's Marines paused for the night along a line stretching from Iramiya to the divisional boundary south of Makibaru, which the 1st Marine Division extended further south to Kadena. Meanwhile, the 7th Division advanced nearly 3 miles inland, destroying several pillboxes but losing 3 tanks to mines. The 96th Division secured positions along the river south of Chetan, on the elevated ground northwest of Futima, in the outskirts of Momobaro, and in the hills northwest and southwest of Shido. Although there were gaps in the lines in several areas, they were filled by reserve units or weaponry before nightfall. Thus, the Battle of Okinawa, seen by most as the final climatic battle of the Pacific War, had only just begun. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I released a very long documentary covering the Boxer Rebellion and Russo-Japanese War, titled The Battle for Asia. And over on Echoes of War, we just covered the Revolt of Boudica. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And if you go over there right now, the latest episode is actually the first part in a multi-part series which is an alternate history of the Pacific War. The first episode titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor. It's going to be very interesting. I do highly recommend it. As Gandalf the White once said, "The board is set, the pieces are moving, we have come to it at last, the great battle of our time." The Battle of Okinawa will become the bloodiest campaign America has ever fought. The soul-crushing journey had just begun for the Americans, and it will be the last stand of the Japanese in this Pacific War.